This is the DJI Mini 4 Pro, and it came out just a few short weeks ago, and people have definitely been talking about it. There's definitely some excitement about this new drone. And while a lot of people are talking about the headline specs, the big flashy numbers that you'll see advertised everywhere, there are a few things that I don't think people are talking about enough. So here are 9 things you need to know about the DJI Mini 4 Pro. So first off, everybody is talking about the 4K 100 frames per second and the 1080p 200 frames per second, which is a very impressive spec, but it can be a little bit misleading. See, when I hear 4K 100 or 1080p 200 frames per second, what I'm expecting is a clip that is shot at 100 frames per second, but played back in real time. But in reality, that 4K 100 and 1080p 200 frames per second is only available in a special slow motion mode. So what you wind up getting is not a clip at 100 frames per second, it's a clip shot at 100 frames per second, but then slowed down to 25. Now, you're probably thinking that's not a huge deal, and in reality, it might not be. But I think it's still important to know that about this drone before you go out and buy it for the 100 frames per second. And because of that, if you do want that 100 frames per second clip played back in real time, you do then have to increase the speed by essentially 4x. And if you are planning on using that extra frame rate for things like digital stabilization in post, just keep in mind that you are not actually getting a 100 frames per second clip. It's going to be at 25 just in slow motion. Speaking of slow motion, the second thing that you should know is that everything from an aerial perspective that is shot from that far up in the sky is likely going to look like slow motion anyway. As you can see in this clip here, the cars are actually moving about 45 to 50 miles an hour, if not more, but in the clip, it looks like they're barely going 5 or 10 miles an hour. And from up in the air, when your subjects are that small, it's not really going to be apparent that it's in slow motion. Realistically, in order to get the most out of that slow motion effect, you're probably gonna have to fly the drone pretty close to you. And realistically, you're not gonna get the most out of that effect unless you're doing something that's really fast paced or, action packed, like skiing or mountain biking or something along that effect. The third thing is related to the camera on this drone. See, the camera has a fixed f1.7 aperture, which is great in low light situations, and it does make full use of that fast aperture in night mode. But because that aperture is fixed at f1.7, you're almost always going to need an ND filter in daylight situations. When I was shooting at sunset, even though the sun had pretty much gone down and it was pretty much dark for the most part, I still found my shutter speed at the 300 to 500 range just to get an even exposure, which if you're shooting at 30, 60 frames per second, you don't really want it to be that high, or else you might get some weird jitteriness in the motion. Now, at the moment, the DJI ND filters have not yet been released, but they are gonna cost around $55 when they do get released, hopefully at the end of October of this year. But keep in mind, if you're going to buy the Mini 4, you're gonna wanna pick up an ND filter set as well, just so you can have a proper shutter speed during daylight conditions. Now, the other thing to keep in mind for filters is that filters for the DJI Mini 3 do not fit on the Mini 4. So you are gonna have to get specific filters for the Mini 4 if you already have them for the Mini 3. Now, speaking of that fast aperture, you're probably familiar with how a wide open aperture affects focus in photos, meaning that more stuff is going to be out of focus. And that is definitely still true with this drone. So the fourth thing you need to know is that this drone is actually capable of being out of focus. And I'm sure plenty of other drones out there can be out of focus as well. In my experience with the Mini 2, it didn't have as much of a problem finding focus, especially when you were shooting a wide enough shot. But with this drone, there were were actually a few times where I was completely out of focus. I was up in the air, it was just a wide shot, should have been pretty easy to focus on, but this thing was out of focus. And even though the screen on the RC2 is pretty large and sizable, it's still kind of difficult to tell just by eye whether or not you're in focus. So if you get this drone, make sure you turn on the focus peaking so that you can actually get a visual indicator of when you are in focus or not. Now, number 5 is a really cool new feature specific to the Mini 2 and possibly some other DJI drones, although I haven't looked at this one too much. But this drone now has 2 gigabytes of internal memory. So basically what that means is if you're like me and have shown up to a location and realized that you forgot your micro SD card, instead of having to use the crappy low resolution footage that was like transmitted to your phone, you can now record the full resolution and the full size clips directly to this drone, up to 2 gigabytes, which is not that much storage. To give you a perspective, in the 12 megapixel photo mode, you can do 113 photos to the internal memory. But if you switch over to 48 megapixel mode, you will only get 28 photos out of that 2 gigabytes. Now, if we switch over to video mode, that 2 gigabytes is going to get you 6 minutes and 15 seconds if you're shooting at 1080p 30. But then if we go over to 4K at 30 frames per second, that 6 minutes now goes down to 2 minutes and 49 seconds. And then if we go all the way up to 4K 60, that is going to give us exactly 2 minutes. And I'm sure it's gonna be much less if we did 4K 100. And while those may not seem like extremely impressive numbers, at the very least, if you do happen to show up somewhere and realize you forgot your SD card, you can still get something. It's definitely going to be limited, but you will at least walk away with something instead of nothing. Now, speaking of storage, this drone got some pretty good upgrades to video frame rates as well as 10-bit color. So that means the video files are going to be a lot bigger than you might be used to coming from the older Mavic Minis like the Mini 2 or the Mini 1. So what that means is your SD cards are now going to fill up a lot faster than they did before if you're used to those older drones. To put it in perspective, I use a 64 gigabyte card in my Mini 2, and in the years that I've been using it, I've brought it on trips, I've brought it camping, I've used it to shoot days on end, and I have never actually filled up the card using a Mavic Mini 2. However, with this Mini 4, I flew for a total of about an hour, so enough time to use up 2 of its batteries, and by the end of that, I had already filled that 64 gigabyte card. So if you're gonna pick up one of these, and if you wanna use the video specs to their full capabilities, I would definitely recommend getting at minimum a U3 micro SD card with at least 128 gigabytes of storage. Know about this drone is regarding the obstacle avoidance and the sensors. While the 360-degree object detection and avoidance is an awesome feature to have in such a small and relatively cost-effective drone, it is not available when you are flying in night mode, nor is it available when you're flying in sport mode. So you can think about it this way. The sensors need to be able to see the obstacles that they're trying to avoid, and the drone itself needs to have enough time to actually slow itself down or come to a stop. In night mode, it's not going to be able to see it, and in sport mode, it's not going to have enough time to stop. So the obstacle avoidance feature is just shut entirely off when you are in those modes. Now, the good news is this drone is actually relatively fast. So in normal mode, you can still go pretty quick. Even in cinema mode, you can actually move pretty quickly as well. So unless you're following a really fast-paced subject like a car or someone riding really fast downhill, chances are you're gonna be able to get by with the normal mode. But if you do find yourself shooting in sport mode or night mode, just keep in mind you're gonna wanna make sure you're very aware of any obstacles around you and make sure you're being very careful when you fly it. So speaking of object avoidance, there are actually 2 different types of object avoidance behaviors that you can use on this drone. The clips and examples you've seen online probably showcase this drone coming to a complete stop when it detects an obstacle. However, there is a second mode called bypass, which will actually fly around the object, assuming it actually sees a path around it. Now, in that bypass mode, there are actually 2 different ways that it can bypass obstacles. One is to simply just fly around them like normal, which may look a little bit jittery and weird. Now, the second mode is called nifty, which means it will try to smoothly and more cinematically, I guess, move out of the way or go around the object. And finally, the 9th thing that you need to know about the DJI Mini 4 is regarding the remote. This is the DJI RC2, which you can get as a bundle with the Mini 4 Pro. And as you can see, it does have a awesome big screen on it, and it is overall a really cool and really nice remote, but the battery life is drastically lower compared to some of the older remotes, especially the ones that use your phone as the screen instead. And I know that may seem painfully obvious, but for me, coming from a much older DJI drone to this new drone and new remote, it was a bit of a shock how quickly the remote runs out of battery. To put it in perspective, this remote that I got with the Mini 2, I've had for about 3 years now. I've taken it on trips, I've taken it camping, I've taken it on long vacations, and I've definitely used it a lot. But every time I was done using it, I made sure to turn it off to conserve battery. And in those 3 years, I have maybe charged this remote 4 or 5 times. The battery on this thing lasts forever. Now with the new RC2, when I first started flying it, I had everything charged to 100%. By the time that I had exhausted 2 batteries for the drone, the battery on the remote was at around 50% already. So if you do get this remote, or if you do get the Fly More bundle for the Mini 4, just make sure you keep in mind, especially if you're planning a trip to a remote location where you may not be able to charge very easily, keep in mind that this will be an extra device that you'll need to charge at some point, whereas some of the older remotes you can bring on a long trip and not worry about charging it once. All right, guys, that's pretty much it. Those are the 9 things I think you need to know about the brand new DJI Mini 4 Pro. So I'd love to know what you guys think. Do you think I've covered everything you need to know about this drone, or do you think there's something that I missed? Let me know in the comments down below. If you found this video helpful, please hit that like button. If you want to see more videos like this, please hit that subscribe button and turn on those notifications so you know when the next one comes out. And with that, I'll see you guys in the next one.